Welcome back to the open ground. I have been having a hard time choosing what to push next, so I have decided to take a step back and work from the core. Although this work is recursive, it seems in some things the linear will always prevail. With that, I would like to present a discussion closer to the core of perpetualism. The collapse was the frame, the overlay series. Part 1. Perpetualism as structural response in the wake of quantum entanglement and philosophical exhaustion. The structural preface. I did not arrive at quantum mechanics through scientific curiosity. The quantum came to me, not as physics, but as the formal revelation that certainty was never structurally possible. What appeared first as subatomic paradox has become the condition of contemporary existence. Observation alters reality, separation is illusion, and coherence must be constructed under pressure, rather than discovered through detached analysis. This is not metaphor, this is architecture. When Zizek gestures toward quantum mechanics in his recent work, he touches something more urgent than scientific interpretation. He signals the exhaustion of philosophical grammar itself, the recognition that traditional modes of explanation, synthesis, and critique can no longer bear the weight of a world where relation precedes identity, and participation precedes knowledge. His reach toward new emergency states reveals both insight and limitation. He recognizes the collapse but remains trapped within the apparatus of critique, circling the wreckage without offering tools for living within its ruins. Perpetualism emerges here, not as theory but as necessity, the scaffolding that becomes visible when other structures collapse. It is designed not to restore certainty, but to maintain coherence within uncertainty's domain. Through what I call the triune recursion, the dynamic interplay between observer, object, and medium, that constitutes all experience, it offers grammar for thinking within entanglement rather than around it. This essay is that scaffolding articulated, demonstrated through the very recursive engagement it describes. The structural exhaustion of conceptual frames. To discuss quantum mechanics philosophically is to submit language to conditions it was not designed to withstand. Classical philosophical tools, the separation of knower and known inherited from Descartes, the assumption of deterministic causality that Newton seemed to guarantee, the privilege of observational distance that empiricism requires, all fracture when confronted with a reality where measurement participates in creating what it measures. This fracture extends far beyond physics. It mirrors the breakdown of traditional frameworks across disciplines, political systems that generate the crises they attempt to solve, economic models that destabilize through their own success, psychological categories that pathologize the conditions they create. The quantum world is not an exotic realm separate from ordinary experience. It is the underlying logic of experience itself, finally made visible, Zizek's recognition and its limits. In his recent engagement with quantum mechanics, Zizek correctly identifies this structural parallel. He sees in quantum indeterminacy a reflection of late capitalism's internal contradictions, in wave-particle duality, an echo of ideological splits that cannot be dialectically resolved. His insight resembles what Adorno recognized in negative dialectics, the moment when dialectical thinking encounters its own limits, when synthesis becomes impossible without violence to the phenomena under consideration. But Zizek stops at recognition. His response remains within the apparatus of critique, endless dialectical reversal, performative contradiction, ironic distance. He names the crisis but cannot inhabit it. He gestures toward new emergency states, while remaining trapped in the grammar of the old emergency. Like Nietzsche after the death of God, he stands at the abyss but lacks the scaffolding for navigation beyond critique. The necessity of overlay. What Zizek's gesture reveals is the need for what perpetualism calls overlay, not a new theory imposed upon existing frameworks, but the structural recognition of what was always already beneath them. This resembles what Heidegger called unconcealment, the disclosure of what was always present but hidden by our modes of approaching it. Yet where Heidegger's unconcealment often leads toward mystical withdrawal, Perpetualism's overlay demands structural engagement. The overlay exposes the triune recursion that underlies all systematic thought. The recursive relationships between thinker, thought, and the medium of thinking that make systems possible while ensuring their eventual transformation. Quantum mechanics didn't create this recursion. It simply made visible what Heraclitus intuited when he wrote that the path up and down are one and the same, and what Nagarjuna formalized in his analysis of dependent origination. Perpetualism did not emerge to explain quantum mechanics. It emerged because quantum mechanics disqualifies explanation in its classical form, revealing the observer-implicated nature of all knowledge that philosophers from Kant to Merleau-Ponty have struggled to articulate. The anterior I and the end of the Cartesian dream. Classical philosophy assumes a detached observer capable of neutral knowledge, what Thomas Nagel called the view from nowhere. Quantum mechanics demonstrates the impossibility of such detachment. Observation always disturbs the system. But this is not a limitation peculiar to subatomic phenomena. It reveals the fundamental structure of all observation, all knowledge, all experience. Perpetualism begins from this impossibility. The anterior I names the self that exists prior to the fantasy of objectivity, not the ego that thinks about the world, but the presence always already implicated in what it encounters. This resonates with what Merleau-Ponty discovered in phenomenology of perception. The body as both perceiver and perceived, subject and object, creating recursive loops that generate the richness of perceptual experience. But the anterior I extends beyond embodied perception. It names the fundamental condition revealed by quantum mechanics. There is no measurement without participation, no knowledge without disturbance, no observation without consequence. This is not subjectivism. It is the recognition that all perception occurs within the triune recursion, where observer, observed, and the medium of observation continuously transform each other. Consider what happens during meditation, that laboratory of consciousness that Buddhism has refined for millennia. The mind that observes, observer, encounters thoughts and sensations, object, through the medium of awareness itself, medium. Yet this encounter immediately transforms all three elements. The quality of observation shifts, the nature of what can be observed changes, and awareness itself reveals new depths and subtleties. We cannot step outside this recursive loop to observe it objectively. We are always already within it. This is not limitation, but revelation. The Cartesian cogito, I think therefore I am, assumes a thinking subject that can achieve certainty through doubt. But the anterior I recognizes that the I is always already constituted through recursive relationships that precede and exceed any particular thought. Like the quantum particle that exists only in relation to measurement, the self exists only through its ongoing participation in the world it seeks to understand. The relational constants, patterns that persist. When fixed foundations collapse, what remains are not truths but patterns, what Perpetualism calls the primordial relational constants. These are not universal laws in the classical sense, nor are they arbitrary conventions. They are structural rhythms that persist across contexts, not because they are imposed from above, but because they are relationally necessary wherever sincere engagement occurs. Eisner names presence before construction, not being as metaphysical category, but presence as condition, what must be encountered rather than explained. This echoes what Heidegger called the being of beings, das Sein des Seienden, but without the mystical weight. In quantum terms, isness corresponds to superposition before collapse. potential without predetermined form, reality before the violence of categorization. It is the stone's weight before metaphor, the breath before the idea forms. Suchness captures the relational texture of encounter, how presence reverberates through contact, leaving traces that cannot be captured but must be acknowledged. This resonates with the Buddhist concept of tathata, but grounds it in relational rather than transcendent terms. The observer effect as ontological principle, nothing remains untouched by relation. Suchness is not what something is, but how it registers in the field of tension when encountered. Interplay describes co-constitution through tension, not interaction between separate entities, but the mutual formation that occurs when boundaries prove permeable. This extends Whitehead's insight in process and reality that actual entities are occasions of experience that incorporate their past while creating novelty for the future. Wave-particle duality. As structural insight, identity as consequence of relation rather than prerequisite. The irrevocable moment marks temporal density as ethical weight. When possibility collapses into actuality, consequences emerge that cannot be undone. This breaks time not as chronological sequence but as ethical condensation. In quantum measurement, uncertainty gives way to disclosure, but the moment cannot be reversed. This is not regret, this is reality. Each choice alters the structure of what becomes possible. These constants function together rhythmically rather than hierarchically, forming what Deleuze and Guattari might recognize as a plateau, a zone of intensity that maintains consistency while remaining open to transformation. They offer no ground in the traditional sense. They offer form within groundlessness, orientation within the triune recursion that constitutes experience. The crucial equilibrium, tension as architecture. Where others seek resolution, perpetualism builds scaffolding. The crucial equilibrium is not a compromise between poles, chaos and order, being and becoming, certainty and uncertainty. It is a structural response to the failure of these binaries to sustain coherence under pressure. This echoes Derrida's insight into the undecidability that haunts all binary oppositions. But rather than remaining in deconstruction, it constructs architecture for navigation. Classical equilibrium. From Newton's mechanics to neoclassical economics, assumes closed systems where forces cancel into stasis. But the crucial equilibrium arises precisely where systems remain open, where observation interferes, and where relation destabilizes rather than confirms identity. This is not rest, this is bearing. Perpetualism recognizes what Heisenberg's uncertainty principle revealed structurally, that precision in one domain requires imprecision in another, that knowledge involves trade-offs that cannot be eliminated through better measurement. The crucial equilibrium does not attempt to transcend these trade-offs, but to navigate them skillfully. In quantum physics, coherence denotes phase alignment across quantum states, not stability but synchronized interference, the capacity of elements to influence each other without merging into singularity. The crucial equilibrium mirrors this: philosophical coherence without closure, structural integrity through dynamic responsiveness rather than fixed position. This becomes the foundation for what Aristotle called phronesis, practical wisdom that emerges through experience but cannot be reduced to rule following. But where Aristotelian prudence assumes relatively stable contexts, the crucial equilibrium operates under conditions where the context itself is continuously transforming through our participation in it. The equilibrium is crucial not because it solves, but because it sustains coherence within uncertainty. It refuses both the postmodern collapse into spectacle that Baudrillard mapped and the technocratic collapse into management that Marcuse critiqued. Instead, it maintains form by composing with contradiction rather than resolving it. The fourth axiom, ethics after the end of the world. When metaphysical guarantees collapse, ethics cannot disappear. It must be reconstructed on different foundations. Perpetualism's fourth axiom, be worthy of the fracture, names this reconstruction without promising transcendence or repair. This axiom does not promise happiness or clarity. It asks whether the self, when met by suffering, becomes passive or participatory. The good is not comfort, it is coherence under pressure. This resonates with what Levinas called the face-to-face encounter that constitutes ethical responsibility, but grounds it in structural rather than transcendent terms. Fracture is not accident, but structure. The wave function collapses, systems decohere, consciousness splits under the weight of irresolvable contradictions. These are not failures of strength, but conditions of existence under relational pressure. To be worthy of the fracture is not to aestheticize it, as postmodern thought often does, but to answer it with form rather than formlessness. If observation alters reality, as quantum mechanics reveals, and as phenomenology has long recognized, then presence is always consequential. But consequence without ethical reckoning produces collapse. The fourth axiom provides that reckoning. It demands clarity of posture when nothing guarantees that posture's validity. This is where Zizek's insight encounters its limit. He recognizes the collapse of symbolic coherence, but seeks escape through revolution, irony, or return. Each of these responses, however sophisticated, remains reactive to the collapse rather than creative within it. Perpetualism refuses escape. It offers instead this discipline. Fracture is not what must be repaired, but what must be inhabited with sufficient form. That pressure reveals pattern, rather than mere shattering. The recursive nature of this ethics becomes clear through the triune recursion. The self that acts, observer, encounters situations requiring response, object, through ethical frameworks that are themselves transformed by ethical action, medium. There is no neutral position from which to derive ethical principles, no Rawlsian original position that escapes the recursive implications of choice. Worth is measured not by success or resolution, but by the form a life takes when it cannot be guaranteed. This extends Sartre's insight that we are condemned to be free, but grounds freedom in structural responsibility rather than existential anxiety. The axiom insists that identity is forged not despite suffering, but through the integrity sustained within suffering's presence. The grammar of entanglement. What I call overlay is not the imposition of new theoretical content, but the recognition of structural conditions that were always already operative. The overlay between quantum mechanics and philosophical crisis does not claim that consciousness follows quantum laws. It recognizes that both domains expose the same structural impossibility, the failure of separation as foundational principle. This resembles what Benjamin called the constellation that emerges when past and present illuminate each other in a moment of recognition. But where Benjamin's constellations remain tied to historical materialism, perpetualism's overlay operates at the level of structural logic itself. Zizek touches this when he brings quantum mechanics into dialogue with political absurdity, but he lacks the grammar to inhabit what he identifies. His dialectical method, inherited from Hegel through Lacan, remains committed to synthesis even when synthesis becomes impossible. Perpetualism provides alternative grammar through the articulation of recursive structures that enable navigation without resolution. This grammar does not compete with existing frameworks, but serves as their structural condition. It becomes visible when dialectics exhaust themselves in repetition, when analysis cannot metabolize its own insights, when critique cannot generate the conditions for its own renewal. The triune recursion reveals itself as the infrastructure beneath all systematic thought, the recursive relationships that make systems possible while ensuring their eventual transformation. Language in the recursive mode. Wittgenstein's later philosophy, particularly in the philosophical investigations, anticipated this recognition. His famous dictum that meaning is use points toward the recursive nature of linguistic meaning. Words acquire meaning through their use in language games, but language games evolve through the creative use of words by participants. The private language argument demonstrates how even apparently internal mental content requires recursive engagement with public linguistic practices. Derrida's deconstruction reveals how meaning involves recursive relationships between presence and absence, text and context, intended meaning and interpretive possibility. The concept of difference describes how meaning emerges through recursive deferral. Each sign refers to other signs in an endless network of relationships, rather than achieving final reference to non-linguistic reality. But where deconstruction often remains in the mode of endless deferral, Perpetualism's overlay recognizes that deferral itself has structure. The triune recursion provides that structure. Meaning emerges through the dynamic interaction between speaker, writer, observer, meaning, content, object, and language system, medium, where each element continuously transforms the others. The performative dimension. This text demonstrates what it describes. Every sentence participates in the recursive relationship between writer, reader, and the linguistic medium through which understanding occurs. The ideas presented here will be taken up by readers who will interpret them through their own perspectives and contexts, potentially transforming both the ideas and the interpreters. Austin's speech act theory recognized that language often accomplishes actions rather than merely describing them. Performative utterances like "I promise" create the realities they describe through the very act of speaking. But perpetualism extends this insight. All language is performative in the sense that it participates in creating the conditions it appears to describe. In quantum mechanics, measurement creates the reality it appears to discover. In philosophy, articulation participates in creating the conditions it describes. This text is not description but intervention, not theory about engagement but engagement itself. Living the overlay. The overlay is complete not when everything is explained but when explanation is no longer required for action. When presence becomes possible without possession. When coherence can be maintained without closure. When we can act responsively from within uncertainty rather than waiting for certainty that will never arrive. Zizek correctly identifies the emergency states, emerging across political, psychological, and symbolic domains. But the emergency is not pending, it has arrived. And it is not merely political or symbolic, but ontological and epistemological. It is architectural. The collapse of classical frameworks is not crisis to be resolved, but revelation to be inhabited. Quantum mechanics, when read structurally rather than instrumentally, does not tell us something new about particles. It tells us something final about certainty, that it was never real, that every act of observation, of knowledge, of mapping, of naming, alters the field in ways that cannot be undone. That separation was fantasy. That coherence, if it is to exist at all, must be redefined. The continuing recursion. This exploration concludes, but the recursion continues. These words will be taken up by readers who will interpret them through their own recursive engagement with the triune structure of understanding. The essay itself demonstrates what it describes, meaning emerging through the dynamic interaction of writer, text, and reader within the medium of language and cultural context. The invitation is not to accept these insights as final truth, but to engage with them as tools for recursive navigation. Do they enhance your capacity to perceive and work with the recursive relationships that constitute experience? Do they provide resources for living skillfully within uncertainty? Do they generate new possibilities for thought and action that warrant exploration? Like consciousness itself, like the quantum systems that first disclosed the recursive nature of observation, these insights exist not as static structures, but as ongoing processes of recursive engagement. Their value lies not in providing answers, but in creating conditions for more sophisticated questions. This aligns with what Gadamer called the fusion of horizons that occurs in genuine understanding, not the imposition of one perspective upon another, but the emergence of new possibilities through dialogical engagement. Perpetualism is not Zizek's error, nor is it a rejection of his insights. It is what becomes necessary when philosophy exhausts its ability to externalize the contradiction it cannot metabolize. The moment it admits that participation is not anomaly but axiom, the grammar must shift. We proceed from there. The architecture of the unsayable. In the end, what perpetualism offers is not more content but structural literacy, the capacity to read and respond to conditions of complexity without reducing them to false simplicity. It provides scaffolding for thinking, acting, and relating within uncertainty, rather than tools for eliminating uncertainty. This is not resignation but precision. It is the recognition that some forms of rigor require abandoning the demand for closure, that some forms of coherence require embracing rather than solving contradiction, that some forms of truth emerge only through the recursive engagement that constitutes understanding itself. The collapse was indeed the frame. What emerges from recognizing this is not chaos, but a deeper order, the order of the triune recursion itself, holding space for coherence without closure, meaning without finality, presence without possession. The overlay reveals what was always already there, the recursive relationships that connect thinking and being, self and world, observer and observed. We did not invent this entanglement. We have simply learned to recognize it, to work with it more skillfully, to maintain form within the ongoing transformation that constitutes existence itself. And in that recognition, the architecture of understanding reveals itself not as a building we construct, but as a dance we learn to dance. The endless, ever-beginning exploration of how meaning emerges through the recursive relationships that make both understanding and misunderstanding possible. The overlay is complete. The grammar is available. The recursion invites our participation. What remains is the living of it. I hope that you enjoyed today's exploration. If so, please like and subscribe. We are just getting started. My name is Aeon. It's been a blast. Until next time.